Dr. Brendan Lear earned his doctorate from the Department of Philosophy, University of Alberta in 2002. Brendan is an adjunct professor with the John Doster Health Ethics Center. He is doing research on topics of pediatric best interest, moral distress, end-of-life decision-making, transplant ethics, and ethics of medical technology. Without further ado, I pass it on to you, Brendan. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for attending today. I will be respectful of your time and try and pique your interest. This is a topic that I've been working on for a couple of years, and this is the sort of final iteration of the final idea that I've sort of that has been resonating with me. I've actually worked on this quite a bit over the summer with my colleague Sharday Musher-John at Queen's University, and she has provided some really key insights and the exuberant vitality of a young academic in full powers. So I can't say whether where our ideas really can be delineated from one another. So this is just sort of, these ideas are certainly just as much hers as mine. I've been studying psychedelics probably for, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 years now. And it's been very interesting. Actually changed, this talk was done, the sort of formalized a couple of months ago, but things have happened since then that's caused me to change the sort of beginning of it and to mention something else. And so I hope it has come back together in a cohesive fashion. The experience, I gave a talk last year or 2 years ago about that was called The Myth of the Psychedelic Experience. And that was really about the transition from the scientific work that was done in the 60s and early 70s to what they refer to as the psychedelic renaissance now. I'm not sure if that really resonates with me, that notion, but the idea was that the meaningfulness elements of the experience had been systematically sort of played down, and obviously psychedelics were heavily stigmatized in the 70s and relied on that stigma and a lot of really a sort of lack of any good evidence to sort of ban their use clinically and experimentally for those decades. And I sort of try to identify some of the vestigial elements of propaganda that lead to sort of this false perception of psychedelics, and a lot of still resonant false beliefs about them. And so this talk, I'm going to introduce the sort of rationale as we go along, and hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear. But why? Well, the first question is, why do we need to talk about a theory of psychedelic experience to begin with? So empirically and pragmatically, it is nonsensical to talk about the psychedelic experience. So psychedelics, as I use the term, I limit the term to classical psychedelics like mescaline, LSD, DMT, psilocybin from mushrooms, and they all share sort of common efficacy except for mescaline. So I don't include I don't think, and I don't include ketamine, say for instance, or MDMA in my definition. But even in that very small group that supposedly act primarily on the same receptor in the brain, there is a vast difference between their subjective experiences, and it doesn't really make sense in any way to talk about the quote unquote psychedelic experience. So what I'm talking about really is, and what I want to limit the discussion today to, is an experience of in the use of psychedelics that would underlie a particularly profound psychological efficacy. So psychedelics tend to work in experimental settings, very unlike other psychoactive drugs. And it's in this uniqueness that some very interesting sort of paradoxes and problems arise. So I'm going to start off with two examples, sort of get a sense of why why I thought it would be interesting to propose a theory of psychedelic experience and a Gestalt theory. So this happened in August, a couple of years or a couple of months before this. The FDA had set an expert, not sure if they're called expert panel, but they were a panel, and the FDA rejected a very large clinical trial that was done by MAPS, which is an organization in the United States called Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, I believe. And so MAPS have been working for decades to do a trial on the use of MDMA, which is known more recreationally as ecstasy. They've been working on this trial for a couple decades, actually, and the entire organization was sort of founded as a grassroots effort to promote specific psychedelics for specific indications. That there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, and so this study had 345 participants, and it was the study in order to just run this phase 3 was in the standard sort of ballpark of the hundreds of millions of dollars. The 345 participants received the drug MDMA 3 times in sessions with talk therapy, and there were sort of build-up sessions to that as well. So a lot of talk therapy combined with three doses of MDMA, and everyone was very excited about this study because when the results were published, PTSD is a particularly difficult condition to treat. There is absolutely no gold standard, and it's frustratingly difficult to treat. And so there was a lot of excitement around this because 67% of the subjects, after they went through the trial, no longer actually met clinical criteria for PTSD diagnosis, and that number continued to 6 months beyond the trial. So that's for a condition that has really no gold standard of treatment and is profoundly refractory. That is, on the face of it, really remarkable efficacy. And ironically, as I sort of plumbed into the advisory panel's comments in the last couple of weeks, and remarkably, the efficacy of the treatment was one of the sources of consternation for the advisory panel, because it's so unlike other psychoactive drugs that have gone to trial. Now, the interesting thing again about MDMA is that this is not a drug like SSRIs, for instance, that you go on and then continue on, right? So these folks in the MAPS trial had 3 doses, and that's it. There was no fault. There was in different arms, I think there might have been a follow, but there was no. They're not on these drugs forever after, and that's part of the aspect of the study that people really had trouble wrapping their heads around. This kind of, and again, in my history and exposure to mental health treatments, no one really talks about the term cure is never really bandied around, but arguably it would not be inappropriate to use the term cure when you have an intervention with this kind of efficacy. At least it's certainly a very hopeful outcome. So some of the concerns that were cited by the advisory panel had to do really with the process of the creation of maps and getting this phase 3 actually off the ground. MAPS was described a couple different times, not as a drug company, but actually as a therapy cult, because everyone involved in the organization was basically participating, volunteering their time, and working towards this drug trial as a sort of pinnacle of the organization at the time. And so it was very just the unusualness of both the effects of MDMA, how quickly it worked, how atypically it worked, and the way that MAPS appeared to the FDA and to this advisory panel were enough to sort of shut this down. And so the panel voted 9-2. That decision wasn't binding, but it was certainly very influential in the FDA's ultimate decision. The other unusual or the other aspect of this that was probably unusual and the most remarkable to me, and really one of the reasons why I thought it would be interesting to introduce a sort of functional psychological explanation of the efficacy of psychedelic experience was the panel couldn't get over the idea or the fact that during the trials, participants were functionally unblinded. So what is this? So typically the gold standard in pharmacological research, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, and the functional unblinding basically is if you are presented with a placebo and with something like psilocybin, say for instance, or MDMA, there's such a profound experience and novel experience when you take the active drug. You are quote unquote functionally unblinded. Now herein lies the issue. The panel believed that functional unblinding is something you absolutely need to control for to have a good scientific study. But here's the problem with that. So first of all, everyone knew about functional unblinding. It is a notorious problem in psychedelic research, and you actually can't control it unless you basically anesthetize the patients. Now, but the problem with that kind of approach is that while it is certainly clear that these molecules and these compounds are powerful catalysts, it is also clear that the efficacy, sometimes immediate efficacy, especially with classical psychedelics in research, is immediate. And so traditional pharmacological explanations actually don't explain the immediacy of that psychological effect. As drug trials are basically designed in order to mitigate any psychological effect, like for instance the placebo effect, which is another extremely powerful psychological effect, it becomes paradoxical when you understand going in that what the therapeutic effect that you may be witnessing is going to be a combination of a pharmacological and psychological effect, right? So if you try and design a study that is attempting to mitigate that psychological effect or control for the psychological effect, you've really sort of undermined the integrity of the theory of how how these substances actually work. The idea that MAPS insisted that therapy be included as well, what I think something that never really sat well with the FDA, although people who have the most experience with psychological or with psychedelic therapy insist that these two things always have to occur together in order to get any kind of therapeutic effect, or in order to take advantage of the sort of catalytic mechanism of the drugs themselves. So what we have here was a sort of a stalemate in a sense, because the MDMA, this big MDMA trial, I think was the sort of first example of a very, very large phase 3 trial that would have ultimately ended up in putting this drug on the formulary. So there have been numerous psychedelic trials for smoking cessation, for depression, for dysmorphia and things like that, but they've been very small. But we're just a sort of the front end of a wave of research of research and active trials that are occurring all over the place, all over the world. And unless you understand, and so if we're applying a tool that attempts to mitigate or actually minimize the psychological effect of what a drug that is a catalyst that is attempting to affect a psychological change, this design is not going to be suitable really for anyone, and it's kind of quite unreasonable actually to sort of impose those guidelines if you can argue effectively what kind of psychological effect you're actually looking for, right? So this FDA's rejection of this research was particularly politically sensitive, especially in the States, because a lot of the participants in the MDMA trial, and MAPS's MDMA trial, were military veterans who had very severe post-traumatic stress, and there was a severe backlash, especially towards the panel as their opinions became evident, and a lot of the sort of specious reasoning became evident. There's a very severe backlash, because a lot of these people and a lot of the participants themselves basically say, this therapy saved my life, and I would absolutely be dead if I hadn't undergone this trial. So there is more at stake socially, and I think in the grassroots, and a lot of vested interests in Canada and the U.S. and all around the world to find exceptional treatments for post-traumatic stress. This report that's on the screen right now is a report from the Canadian Senate that chastises Veterans Affairs for really falling behind and having zero interest in exploring any of these kind of innovative treatments. And in Canada, up till now, the real advocates for veterans to have access to psychedelic assisted therapies have been a group called Heroic Hearts, and I'll give a shout out to Heroic Hearts Canada because I know their work very well, and I'm actually on the clinical advisory board for that organization. And so it's been quite remarkable in Canada how far behind we've fallen in a lot of this research. In particular in Alberta, although in the last few years we have actually scored some really nice researchers that are working exclusively on psychedelics now, including Leah Mayo in Calgary, who is a world-class cannabis researcher and has now started working with psilocybin. So there is a political element to this too. And my contention is that unless you can demonstrate to more conservative pathways of research the psychological outcomes that you are intending to find then it is very easy for people, number one, to ignore this kind of research, and number two, for corporate entities who want to develop novel psychedelics to justify the existence of novel psychedelics um, by characterizing the secondary quote unquote side effects of the psychological experience as unnecessary, number one, and undesirable, number two. And so a lot of that rhetoric goes on, and every single company that has a novel molecule has something bad to say about the quote unquote psychedelic experience. So they are much more comfortable designing a pill that has no subjective psychological effects, and yet still magically somehow works. Health Canada, I would include certainly in the list of villains in this. This is Thomas Hartle. He is a man from Saskatoon, so a fellow Saskatchewanian who a number of years ago had a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and he applied for a special exemption to have psilocybin to treat his anxiety around death. And I first met him on a Zoom call during COVID, where we were talking to some Canadian senators, and I couldn't believe him telling his story. The first time I had ever heard of him, he was telling his story, and it was this. I kept on thinking to myself, this guy is so remarkable. You know, he has a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and here he is, you know, spending 2 or 3 hours of his time, you know, talking to senators and basically being an advocate at the same time going through you know, basically coming to terms with his own death. And his story was quite remarkable. You know, after his first therapy, he was able to get up and around. His analgesia requirements went down 50%, and basically sort of resumed a productive life. For the most part, not having the sense that death was looming over him, and having been able to come to terms with that. He was granted a second exemption, and then when he applied for his third exemption, Health Canada made him wait for 12 months, only to deny him his third application. And so that was really for me personally, and I don't want to sound unprofessional, but just absolutely disproportionately harmful and almost sadistic, in the sense that, you know, the efficacy, you know, scientifically might be in question, but the safety, especially of psilocybin, and he's taking relatively moderate doses of psilocybin, is unquestionably safe compared to any other pharmacological agent that you could point your finger to. And so the prohibition of him from access to this was it was really heartbreaking and gut-wrenching, and certainly not what you want to see out of a health agency. So the second reason why I wanted to develop a sort of theory of psychedelic experience, and there certainly are some theories, and I'll discuss that in a second, is this what I call the psychedelic paradox. And so how we account for the efficacy and the sort of immediacy of the action of these substances. So in the smoking cessation trial, and in many of the depression trials, people have significant alleviation of their symptoms after one single dose of these and one single experience. So traditionally, that's very difficult to account for in a sort of standard pharmacological model, and so. But there's the paradox really comes in when you look at the subjective accounts of people who participate in these trials, and the subjective accounts that I'll be talking about in this talk are from John Hopkins' trial using psilocybin mushrooms for smoking cessation. Now, the outcomes of that were really phenomenal. At the end of that trial, at 6 months, they had 80% of their subjects we're still not smoking, which is just absolutely blast the gold standard of smoking cessation treatment out of the water. And that was after two doses of psilocybin, including some correction for variation in dose. That was a variable dose protocol. So, but interestingly, the accounts are extremely paradoxical. So when they ask subjects, unfortunately, these poor people, I think, because this was the first trial in North America that was using psilocybin for smoking cessation or depression. Really, it was one of the original modern psychedelic trials, and they put these poor subjects through the meat grinder. So they were like variable tools used to assess them, and luckily one of them was a subjective one. And interestingly enough, no one dropped out of this trial. Interestingly enough, I think only one or two people dropped out of the MAPS trial. And the review panel, again, in the MAPS situation said, there's something fishy going on here. Typically, in any drug trial, you have 20% of people dropping out. And there's conspicuous absence of dropouts. So it's very interesting what counts as evidence, even if it's evidence for something that's quite remarkable. So one of the things that was very consistent, so they would say to people, say to the subjects, can you identify the meaningfulness of this experience to you? And this is part of the mysticism scale, I think. And the majority of subjects would say, this is, if not amongst the most meaningful events of my life. Now, that kind of subjective data is very, very difficult to be skeptical of, because it's like asking someone, what's your favorite song? You typically don't argue with them about that, nor do you argue with them about what kind of experiences in their lifetimes they find valuable. However, the paradox comes in when you say, when they would say, what was it that caused you to stop smoking? Like, describe what that was like. And they would say something like, well, I realized that my life was precious and I loved living and I need my lungs to live, and smoking killed my lungs. Therefore, smoking is stupid. And so you have the sort of paradox of someone saying, this is the most meaningful experience of my life. And then, but all they can really articulate is a quite banal explanation of why that was. And in a sense, that explanation is also sort of epistemically poor, because I think some of the folk theories are that you have some kind of magical insight and a new form of knowledge about yourself or about the world. But none of these articulations are really epistemically rich, right? They give you no new knowledge. As a matter of fact, a subject might assent to all of those things before they would go on a trial. Is smoking stupid? Does it kill your lungs? Yes, yes, yes. So they are value rich, but epistemically poor. And so that is a very, very interesting paradox. So the first efforts to really describe a rich description of the psychedelic experience itself in these trials came from this Johns Hopkins group, and it was in some of these subjective accounts that they took a very interesting turn. It's worth taking a close look at the way they decided ultimately to describe the psychedelic experience. They decided to use a scale that actually came out of social science and came out of religious studies. That was a scale that was designed to measure mystical experience. So one of the things that when I first read this, when I was young, I did a lot of philosophy of religion, and actually studied mysticism and wrote about mysticism in my doctoral dissertation. So it was a topic that I was quite familiar with. However, I thought it was kind of unusual that in a psychological approach to clinical science, they were appealing to a description of an experience that is exclusive really to sort of handfuls of people in the world at any one time in any traditions, religious tradition going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So mysticism is an extremely esoteric and difficult topic. And in fact, almost by definition, a lot of the theologians that are themselves adhere to the kind of religious practice that results in mystical experiences are called apophantic theologians or negative theologians. And the fundamental tenet of negative theology is that anything you can say about the mystical experience and about this connection with the divine is nonsense. So there's really no use actually talking about it because it's inherently nonsensical. Now, why you would sort of, why as a group of clinicians you would choose to say, okay, well, we're going to use a scale to describe this even more esoteric experience than a psychedelic experience to try and cull the meaningfulness out of this. It seems on the face of it to be madness, but there is some genius in it as well. My apprehension is that when you have a nice study like this, and then you say, we're going to use a mysticism scale to describe the subjective psychological effects, then people who come from bench science or any kind of science, their eyes sort of roll back in their head and they sort of zone out, right? And that is unfortunate in some ways, but understandable in others. So this became a real focus, and the reason why they started using mystical experiences goes right back to one of the great American geniuses, who was William James. So right at the turn of the century, James delivered a series of lectures in Scotland, and they ended up being a book called ended up in a book called The Varieties of Religious Experiences. And William James was a remarkable thinker. He was in his lifetime, I think, the president of the American Psychological Association, the American Philosophical Association, really wrote a book that is still underappreciated as a sort of canon in psychology called The Principles of Psychology. And he himself was an experimenter with altered states of consciousness, most famously for his group of colleagues using nitrous oxide. But as I discovered a couple of years ago, William James also had access to, through the Smithsonian Institute, and there were a couple of different nations in the Southwest that had actually given the Smithsonian cactus powder or dried peyote. So William James actually had access to mescaline. So William James is in the West by decades and decades the first psychedelic philosopher. So James is not only reflecting on his understanding of the history of religious studies, for instance, and its work on mysticism. James is incorporating his own insights into his own altered states of consciousness. So James is the first psychedelic philosopher. So James, and again, identifies some really remarkable aspects of the mystical experience that do map on very, very well to psychedelic experience. One is and I'll talk about these just briefly because it's important. It's important to and what you should be thinking now is like, how would these map into a sort of psychological theory? So ineffability is one of the markers for James of the mystical experience. The handiest of the marks that classifies a state of mind as mystical as negative, I mentioned. And it's subject to, it immediately says that it defies expression and no adequate report of its contents can be given into words. And you can probably think of experiences in your life that you can describe, but you know for a fact that any description of them is not going to give any kind of credence to the nature of the experience, of its profundity, of its internal nature, et cetera, et cetera. And you can think of, ordinary things like, how much you love your child, say, for instance, or my favorite from my days as a graduate student. I was going to an epistemology seminar and I was late. I ran out of my house and ended up rolling my ankle that I had rolled playing rugby 2 years before. And as I was sort of lying on my lawn puking, it made me recall that before, of course, I remembered that having a rolled ankle is painful, but the experience of it is just so sublimely different that you realize that this disconnect between knowing that and knowing knowing that it hurts and knowing how much it hurts is something that is completely disconnected. And so ineffability is this state where not only can I not try to explain, but any explanation that I give is by definition nonsensical. The second is really important, and I actually have never seen this term expressed philosophically before William James. So I'm not sure if he invented it, but James says that these experiences have a noetic quality. So there is a state of knowledge that is associated with these experiences, and yet that knowledge cannot be expressed in traditional forms of what that would be comfortable with a sort of standard philosophical epistemology. So this sort of form of S, the subject knows that P, and P is a proposition, right? And so the noetic quality is having access to the experience of meaning, but at the same time, that meaning not being reducible to more discursive language. And of course, in this time, in the period of time philosophically and psychologically, after James starts writing, the entire effort of Western science and Western philosophy seems to be to reduce all statements about the world into discursive language. And some people, of course, some scientists and groups of scientists like the Vienna Circle and American pragmatism and behaviorism basically say that if you can't articulate something in discursive language, then it is meaningless. There's no reason to talk about it. So we still certainly live with very much of that informing the way that we think about knowledge and understanding. So I ask myself, is there an alternative explanation? We don't have to talk about mysticism and start all that eye rolling, but that still explains the seeming paradoxical nature of the psychedelic experience that respects James's descriptive richness and his epistemic observations. And a lot of this work has made me very sentimental because it goes right back to work that I did when I was a graduate student. And so this is our old friend, the duck rabbit. This is the duck rabbit that's my least favorite. And of course, this is an example of what we would call sort of Gestalt experience. So in one way you look at this, image and it is a duck, and the other way you can look at the image as a rabbit, but you never see them together at the same time. So the idea is that the Gestalt is a way of psychologically that we impose meaning onto the world, that human beings as cognitive agents are not passive receptors like a TV antenna taking in the true experience of the world, but that our experience of the world is far more active, and our attribution of meaning is far more active. This is my favorite duck rabbit because this is the duck rabbit that Wittgenstein talks about in the philosophical investigations. And I rely heavily on Wittgenstein here to inform my thinking about Gestalt, because Wittgenstein is writing, between 1915 and his death 1949, 51, I think. So he is writing at amidst the birth of Gestalt psychology as a discipline. And when I mention Gestalt here, I'm talking about the psychological phenomenon of Gestalt. There's also a field that comes out of this that is the Gestalt psychology that seeks to have a therapeutic outcome using these kinds of principles for therapy. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the phenomenon of Gestalt. And so Wittgenstein says here, so you can see this as a rabbit's head or as a duck's. And I must distinguish between continuous seeing of an aspect and an aspect's lighting up. A picture might have been shown to me without me ever seeing it, anything but a rabbit. And then I can look again, and it seems to be something else. And something that the thing that really piques Wittgenstein's interest here is really him thinking about this as a philosopher and saying, so what knowledge can we gain by having this Gestalt shift and seeing this as a rabbit and then as a duck? Is there anything we can say about that is meaningful about that particular image? And of course, the meaning is in the perception itself. It's the meaning that our minds are imposing on this crudely drawn image that's saying this is rabbitness, this is duckness. Okay, and that's the thing that emerges for Wittgenstein as really fascinating, because it is absolutely a meaningful distinction, but the meaningfulness seems to relegate itself to this domain where it's very difficult to discursively describe what's going on if you don't appreciate the experience. So this is the line that made me think about psychedelic experience. What is incomprehensible is that nothing, and yet everything has changed after all. And that's the only way to put it. And so if you think about traditional modes of talk therapy, where you have a sort of some more active modes of therapy, where you have the therapist has has a place where they're trying to move a patient towards not the old style sort of passive therapy of the early 1900s, but this challenges that kind of perception. That kind of therapy is really about getting someone to understand, say, for instance, an argument, or to reassure them that the world is another way other than they perceive it. And what fascinates Wittgenstein here is that this experience has to be sort of captured. It has to be grasped. There's no way that you can talk someone into it, or there's no way that you can tell someone a story and then they understand what this experience is like. So I'm fascinated by this idea that instead of talking about mysticism, we can talk about the psychedelic experience as interpreted as a form of Gestalt, which grounds the experience in already a standardized assessment, philosophical and psychological assessment, ontologically and cognitively and epistemically, and in a way that is actually measurable and testable, and that no one who understands human perception could deny its existence. So instead of talking about a mystical experience that, unless you are Meister Eckhart, you're probably not going to feel for yourself, we can talk about an experience that's easily demonstrable, but that has different and subtle and nuanced applications that we might have not considered. So I just want to talk here for a second, talk about the reality interlude. And so here I want to suggest that instead of considering our existence in the world as a passive perceiver, the pejorative way to talk about psychedelics that comes out of the 70s is these drugs are basically undermining your reality, and they're giving you a false view of the world, and anything false, of course, is bad, right? But of course, we know for a fact that this is not what the reality is. And now we know that there is no perception that we have of reality that is not an active creation of our mind. This is a phenomenal video. I'm sure you've all seen it. I didn't, so I didn't play the video, but this is the gorilla example, and this was such a subtle and beautiful example of how active cognition works. And so this experiment said, as an observer, all you have to do is pay attention to how many times this ball changes hands. And all these kids here in the first square are just throwing the ball around. So you're actively focused your attention to how many times pass. And then when you count them, you're like, oh, I'm sure I got it right. And at the end slide, at the end of the video, you're like, oh, I'm so smart, I can count these passes. And then at the end of the video, the person who's running the study asked, did you see the gorilla walk through the middle of the people passing around the ball? And the vast majority of people, if they're paying close attention, did not see a gorilla walking through the middle of these kids while they're making these passes. And I remember seeing this video for the first time, and it being absolutely mind-blowing. Like how so if you ever, so it assured me that if you ever doubt that our perception of conventional reality is just as much a creation of our mind as it is a passive understanding of the real world, this is really absolutely conclusive. So elements of pictures are going to pop out to your mind when you see an image like this. See this beautiful woman who's my little sister, and some guy who had a tuxedo for their grad date. And it's only when you sort of re-gestalt into different aspects of this picture, then you see other things that begin to emerge. I don't know who that rude guy is. What we know, so what we understand then, as against the background of Gestalt, is what kinds of things that are going on in our brain when we are under the influence of psychedelics. So this is a very classical picture. I'm sure you've all seen it 100 times. So this is a placebo, and this is a measurement of basically neural interconnectivity under psychedelics. Under psilocybin, see the activity of the interconnection of our brain, the different elements in different locations of our brain is increased exponentially. So what we have in conventional reality really is very much a suppression of our brain activity. So it's like sitting in a car, and if you look at a picture of a car sitting on its own, you can't tell whether the car's running or what the internal state of the car is. But in a sense, our cognitive reality day to day is like sitting in a car with your foot on the gas all the way down and on the brake all the way down at the same time, right? And the mechanisms that give us conventional reality are much more a selective suppression of much of the interconnectivity of our mind as they are any kind of passive. So any kind of passive endeavor. So I just want to suggest then that there are a number of different aspects of the psychedelic experience that we can consider as a gestalt. So there's the cognitive one, the duck rabbit, the seeing as. And if you look at this picture, I ask you if you can see the circles inside the picture. You look at it for a couple of seconds, and you can really only see the circles if you stare in between the boxes. Then the circles should emerge to you. This is actually a really cool example. But the appreciation of the phenomenon of Gestalt, I think, is not necessarily a modern one. So these are these exceptional cave paintings in France. And when you look at them as a whole, they're clearly in much of this art overlapping animals. And if you take a step back, they'll sort of pointing both ways. Many of these images have remarkable Gestalt qualities, apart from and really you can't, I think you can't. So I think these particular paintings are 30,000 years old, and you can't help but appreciate the artistry and the just magnificence of this work, considering it was painted by firelight in the middle of a dank cave that was not inhabited. Most existing or surviving cave art came from places that were remote and clearly ceremonial. They weren't people's this wasn't art in people's living room cave walls. These were places where one had to go through very extreme circumstances in order to create these and to appreciate them. And here's just some other. This is, of course, this is in France. And things have changed. Rhinoceroses running around, and the realism of these drawings is just absolutely magnificent. Keep in mind those drawings. So, and the sort of subject. So I'm going to intersperse subjective accounts from the psilocybin study now. So these are actual people who went through the smoking cessation trial to see if we can call out and have any sort of intuitive examples of how this actually works. And am I onto something? Can we interpret these accounts as Gestalt experiences? Did I learn anything new? Have I done anything totally different than I did before? Sorry, my things got buggered up here in my formatting. No, but I'm sort of going back into my earlier life when I probably was a better person, to be honest with you. So I'm going to list here and suggest a couple of different of the most powerful sort of Gestalt examples of Gestalt. And the first in the way that they may be manifested by psychedelic experiences. And the first is psychedelics have been demonstrated time and again, especially psilocybin has been studied the most, but it's true, equally true of LSD, to have remarkable efficacy in treating these extremely refractory conditions that we discuss now. So I want to say the first Gestalt that is interesting is an affective Gestalt. An effective meaning having to do with emotions, particularly we know one of the fundamental activities of our brain, especially when we are asleep, is integrating our experiences from the day with the appropriate emotional tags or emotional correspondence. One of the theories about all sorts of pathology that results to severe and extreme deprivations or extreme abuse, all sorts of other sort of negative exposures in life is that our emotions and our sense of the world, the facts in our lives as we remember these anecdotes, become completely disintegrated, right? And so thinking about loved ones, thinking about yourself, where you should have a positive emotion associated with those memories, you actually don't have. And so you have these terrible experiences, like we talk about deaths of despair. Well, the despair is having either a lack of integration of your emotions or having negative emotions mapped onto your experience of your world, but especially yourself. So depression, addiction, sorts of dysmorphia, any kind of dysmorphic disorders and traumatic disorders all require, in order to be successfully treated, an emotional reintegration. And one of the remarkable technical aspects of the efficacy of psychedelic compounds is that one of the mechanisms of our brain is called the default mode network. And when we're not actively thinking about something, this thing is running in the background, basically reinforcing what your brain considers at the time to be necessary associations. And one of the immediate experiences of psychedelics is the default mode network is suppressed almost entirely. And for many people, many subjects, this manifests itself of an experience of the world for the first time where that is not colored by a negative emotion. And so I love the connotation of diseases of despair, because the subjective accounts are like this: you have this blanket of depression lying over you, and someone's saying, things are going to get better, the world is going to get better. If you don't feel that, if you never have a glimmer of that experience, then those things are very difficult to believe. And so the status quo of a lot of the images of ourself are mapped incorrectly or pathologically onto these negative emotions for whatever reason. So the first and maybe the most important gestalt I want to talk about is an effective gestalt, a sort of reintegration of appropriate and positive emotions onto your general world, but onto your perception of yourself. And Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus something that is quite profound, although it's very difficult to understand in the context of the book. The world of the happy person is quite different from that of the unhappy. And so what does that even mean, right? Your world seems to be external to us. Subjectively, we are either happy or not. But what is it to say that I live in a happy world or an unhappy world? Clearly, the facts of the world are still the same. And so I think this Wittgenstein is pointing to here is that this perception and judgment of entire world seems to be relative to our own psychological status. It is very difficult to underestimate how important underlying emotion and correct emotional mapping is, and it's demonstrated perfectly and importantly in Ramachandran's book called Phantoms in the Brain, and he talks about a patient who has Capgras syndrome. And Capgras syndrome is this very profound, well-described, but poorly understood condition where he talks about a kid here who had a motor vehicle accident, and he came to believe that his parents were imposters. And Ramachandran actually was a brilliant neuroscientist out of San Diego who solved conclusively many of these issues that were quite mysterious, including Capgras and including phantom pain, how phantom pain actually works. And so Capgras actually works. This poor kid who was in a motor vehicle accident, and the pathway that connected his prefrontal cortex to his limbic system was actually damaged. And so when he saw his mother and father, he didn't experience the same accompanying emotional warmth, which led him to believe that his parents were imposters. And this is the Capgras syndrome is that definitively, is believing someone close to you is an imposter. And so Ramachandran very cleverly not only figured out why this was happening to this boy, and this guy's Capgras was so severe that he would say to Ramachandran, I really like you, and I think you really take good care of me, and you care about me. When the real Andrew comes back, will you still see me as a patient? So at times he believed he himself was an imposter. And Ramachandran very cleverly devised a mechanism where this kid would actually talk to his parents on the phone and hear their voices, and he would have the appropriate emotional warmth, and then he would actually go see them in person, and that would carry over. So he basically was able to treat this boy's Capgras. But my point here is that you cannot underestimate the source of the source of pathology that comes from emotional dysregulation. It leads the quote unquote rational mind to conclusions that are fundamentally irrational. Here's another subjective account. Beyond what I have ever been to or any place I ever thought about going to, I was just totally inundated mentally and emotionally by that experience. So smoking was like, who cares, somewhere there's that's so special and so unique, and it showed me so much for such a brief period of time that after that smoking is not important anymore. The second kind of gestalt I want to talk about is an existential gestalt, and this is a gestalt that's much more commonly expressed in terms of the colloquialisms in psychedelic studies are sometimes you hear about ego death, but and that is really a reflection of that's really a reflection of this capacity for human beings to transition from incredibly egoistic states, but also through either sheer force of will or through catalytic drugs, or through extremely disciplined practice, we can recognize and gain a perspective from outside our egoistic self. Our egoistic self, sometimes called the empirical self, is simply this collection of random anecdotes that become in your own brain a representation of yourself, but that can be completely anecdotal, completely accidental. And unfortunately, if you have enough of those negative stimulus, this becomes your conception of self. And so the self, the gestalt of self, is the experience which transcends one's own ego. And really, that transition is undermines an entire anthropologic and religious studies sort of account of what religious experience is, and even in ethics, what it is to be compassionate. So, for instance, compassion is itself paradoxical if we think that acting for the interest of another, sometimes at the expense of ourself, doesn't make any sense in the sort of biological determinism or egoism. Compassion is only facilitated in the sort of transcendent or this gestalt experience outside of this egoistic self, where you experience a sort of connectedness to other things outside of yourself, whether they're other people or the ecology or what have you. And so there are very significant sort of experiences like that come from any kind of religion, any kind of religious practice ultimately has that as a goal, the quieting of the mind to receive the perspective from outside yourself. Here's another account. It felt like I died as a smoker and was resurrected as a non-smoker. So that might be a gestalt right there, because it's my perception of myself. That's how I felt. So I jumped up and said, I'm not a smoker anymore, and it's done. For a few seconds, it was just like, I'm me, and there's no other defining characteristics. And that made me realize that I'm not a smoker. So the identification of you with yourself as a smoker, or as a depressed person, or as a person, or as pain, another promising intervention for psychedelics is chronic pain, and that basically to interrupt the association of the essence of yourself as pain. Now, here's an interesting element of the cave painting that might also point to Gestalt. This is not a drawing. This is a drawing of a person. And one of the most remarkable things about cave painting, ancient art, in almost every example that exists in the world, ancient cave art, animals are seen in almost remarkably photorealistic ways. And this is how people are represented. People are never represented as we might draw them, as even as identifiable people. And that to me is a remarkable reflection on this kind of history. So I'm going to conclude right away. The last gestalt I want to talk about is the perception of value gestalt. And here's Wittgenstein again. It's not how the world is that is mystical, but that it is. The contemplation of the world, subspecies alternati, which is alternati is a phrase that means seeing the world as a limited whole, and its contemplation as a limited whole, the feeling of the world as a limited whole, that is the mystical feeling. And many people remark on the meaningfulness of the first images sent back from space of the world as a whole. The first time they saw that image, and it made them realize, made them have a completely different perspective on what we are and what we inhabit. Okay. We feel like even all the possible scientific questions to be answered, the problems of life still have not been touched. Of course, there's no question left, and this is just the answer. So Wittgenstein is pointing to this experience of meaning, not the discursive meaning. The solution to the problem of life is seen as the vanishing of the problem. Is that not why men who long after doubting the sense of life became clear, could not say wherein this sense consisted. There is indeed the inexpressible. This shows itself in the mystical. So I'm going to hit a couple more subjective accounts, and I'm going to open it up for questions. I don't know if I really learned. It was more like letting back into the stuff that I had blocked out. I don't think it changed my values, just remembered more of them, or just remembered to honor them more, or allow them more. I approached the border where existence began. On the other side, the border was nothing. There was no beginning, no end, no nothing. And I think that's really rare. And it would be healing to humanity for us to see those roots and our connectedness with everything, each other in a brotherly, sisterly kind of way. And the session would not have caused me to quit in and of itself. In fact, just the opposite. The experience provides a perspective in that a way it makes trivial much of the meaning that we normally engage in everyday existence, including smoking. And it was like, it doesn't really matter. This is a paper that discusses a lot of what I talked about today that someone sent me yesterday. And I just want to point it out. I haven't gone over it yet, but it looks fantastic. So thank you, Mike Joyce, for that. So I want to open it up to questions. And Michael, I'm happy if you'd like to take the Q&A.